Welcome to Aesthetic Academy.
Hello, welcome back to the Aesthetic Academy. I'm Tap, as always. Today we're gonna do a little chalk talk. Unfortunately, Mint is busy, having fun doing some stuff. B is feeling not well, so you're stuck with just me today. But we'll do some chalk talk. How's that sound, gang? So if you have any questions or any, like, you know, anything that's been on your mind that you're like, hey, what's up? How do I do this? How do I do that? Feel free, raise your hand, let me know, and we'll see. We'll see if I can't answer some, you know, some questions, some things. For now, I don't know what we're gonna get into. What kind of nonsense are we getting into? Oh, we're a little bit early because it's just, like I said, it's just me today. So we'll see. We'll see what kind of nonsense we can get up to today. Yeah. Let's see. There is one subject I did want to go over at some point. And you know what? Today might be that one point. So we talked about it a little bit before, right? How our brains work, right? We've got this big lump of mass and tissue and whatnot, and it's doing all its weird stuff and all its gooby nonsense, right? Got our weird little brain. You gotta love it. It's full of goobery nonsense. Boop boop boop. Right. So, something that happens when you're learning art that a lot of people don't take into account, right, is that our brains categorize things in separate boxes. I've talked about it before on my Picardo stream, but for those of you who don't, is now live. Okay, well, thank you, Stream Elements, for being now live. I don't know what's true anymore. In case I wasn't live before, welcome to the Aesthetic Academy. I'm Tap, as always. Unfortunately, I'm gonna be alone today. B is not feeling well. Mint is out doing some fun stuff. So we're gonna do a little bit of chalk talk, see if we can't answer some burning questions for people, or at the very least, just explain a few things. For right now, let's see. Let me real quick make sure like all the notifications and shit went and did their thing. I don't know why mine's not working. I don't know why mine is not working. I might need to like relink it or something. But let's do this. There we go. So, we're talking brains, right? Our brains love to categorize things, and we talked about this a little bit in our Picardo stream, but here it'll actually be, you know, be more concise, hopefully. So there's a little math trick that happens with a lot of it's like a little joke that you can pull on your people. Chalkboard. Hello, Pokety. Yeah, we're doing some chalkboard stuff. So there's a little thing that can happen with your brain. It's this little math trick that you can do where you say, hey, what's 1 plus 5? And of course people will say 6. And then you go, what's 2 plus 4? And then they go 6. And we go like, what's 3 plus 3? And then they go 6. And then we say, name a fruit that's, you know, or like name a fruit or something like that, right? And people will instantly jump to an orange, or you say like name a vegetable, and people will instantly jump to carrot. And you might be thinking like 666, yeah. You might be thinking like, why does that happen, right? Like, why does that happen? And it's because our brains put everything into these little boxes, right? And for some reason, our brain will categorize things that have 6 letters, right? So orange has 6 letters, so it puts it into this box. The actual name orange has 6 letters, so it puts it into this box. The word carrot has 6 letters, so it puts it into this box. And that's such a weird thing for our brains to do. But they work with this iconography, right? And that's what we're talking about today. Iconography. Or iconography? I don't know. It doesn't matter. Not important. What's important is our brains work with iconography, right? And so when we're drawing, we do this thing, right? Where we say, can we draw an eye, right? And everyone will recognize this. Everyone will go, yeah, I've drawn an eye. I've done this, right? And that's because our brain has taken what it sees, right? It takes what we're actually observing, right? Which might be a gaggle of lines and nonsense and all sorts of stuff, you know, and it will convert it into this. And then when it puts it into our brain, right? When it puts it into our brain, it wants to put it into one of these boxes. So it's going to reduce everything to this symbol so that it can pull it out faster. So that anytime we say, hey, we want to draw an eye, we want to discuss an eye, or anything like that, it's going to pull it out of this box and make us draw the symbol. Because that's how our brains work. Our brains want symbols. Our brains need to like work with stuff faster. And it's not doing a terrible job. It's, you know, marking the key features of like curves and then a circle and stuff like that, right? So our brain is making shortcuts for us. And this is where style actually comes from too, is how you do reductions. But, hi Sugar Girl, how's it going? So our brain will do these reductions, and that's good, that's fine and well. But when you're actually trying to draw specifically an eye, right? We need to tell our brains not to work with this iconography, right? And hopefully you guys can hear me, right? Ro, can you hear me? Yes, you can. Okay, good. So what we're trying to tell our brain, right, is we're trying to get... You're listening very intently. Thank you. We're trying to sever this, right? We're trying to tell our brains not to go... Tell our brains not to go to these boxes, right? We don't want that. We don't want the boxes that everything gets put into. And what we want to do is sever that connection and tell our brain, slow down and look at what you're actually observing. Because when you're looking at drawing an eye, right, it's never this right? It's never that. What you're looking at is a ton of different folds and features that actually happen. And we've got the socket that forms around it. And then we've got the epicanthal fold. And then we've got our brow ridge that starts to form. And then we've got our eyebrow, right? And then again, we get more folds happening because this exists in three-dimensional space, right? And it's our job as artists to convert what we're seeing. Right? It's our job as artists to convert what is actually on, like in front of us, onto the paper. And so when you're looking at an eye, it's never this, right? we're looking at so many more different shapes and features. And so art is 100% a mental game. It's a way to retrain your brain into how to see the world. And so when people say look with an artistic eye, had to really force yourself to slow down and open your fucking eyes. Yeah. So when people say look at something artistically, they're not saying use magic powers or some skill or something that people are like, oh, I have this special, Sharingan type shit. No. We're not doing any of that. What they're saying is look at, actually take a moment, analyze what you're actually seeing. Don't just go, yeah, I know what an eye looks like. Because that's your brain jumping the gun. It's your brain using these boxes, right? We need to slow down and tell ourselves, no, we don't know what an eye looks like. What are we actually observing? Because you'll find that depending on the scenario, people's shapes of their eyes will change, right? You might get, someone who's real excited and all of this stuff will change. You'll get the epicanthal fold won't even really appear. This will show up so much more. You'll get this squash and stretch going on. And so this doesn't match this. So when you're doing observations, actually observe what you're seeing, actually take a moment to look at what you're looking at, right? And it'll change depending on the angle that you're viewing it at, So if somebody's looking down, you might not even really see most of their eye. You'll see this kind of thing, right? And maybe you'll see more lash. So that's the thing, is that when you're looking at stuff, stop working with symbols. We need to eliminate the use of symbols in our art, right? Is because we're not doing it justice. And this isn't, I'm not saying you have to do all the time, right? Because we talked about this is how reduction works. So our brain's doing really well. We can't be mad at our brain entirely, right? Is when we work with style, or trying to stylize anything, we are reducing, because we're not going to spend forever drawing this. We might instead go boom, boom, and then something like this, right? Some sort of anime styling, right? And that's fine and well, but the base structure is still there, right? We've got the upper lid, right? We've got the lower lid. These are our constraints. And then we've got the iris, the pupil, the sclera, all of that sort of stuff. And so we're reducing how many lines we're actually working with in order to create this anime styling. So if your teacher's ever gotta be hey brain, hold on to that thought for later, I'm doing the studies right now. Exactly. So if your teacher or art teacher or whatever ever gets mad at you for doing anime style, right? They can fuck right off. Because it's still valid. Anime styling is still valid. You're still drawing what you're seeing. It's just you're stylizing it. What they're usually getting mad at you for is that they're trying to teach you how to not work with iconography. They're trying to teach you how to observe what's actually happening. And when you do reduction, you're skipping that step in your brain, right? So we'll slow down from now on. That's all you got to do is slow down. Tell your brain that you don't actually really know what you're looking at. We can stylize later. Like Ro said, we're going to stylize after. But first, we're going to actually observe and work on what we see in front of us. They wanted you to show your work. They're a teacher after all. Exactly. And that's the thing too, is that sometimes teachers don't word things the best. So if you have a bad art teacher, every chance is that they might just not know how to word things to you. Not to say that there aren't a bunch of bad art teachers. So, Another thing that happens is light and shadow, right? Take a look at your hand, and if you have any sort of shadow scenario, right? Your brain will instantly tell you, hey, we've got, you know, we've got our hand here, right? So let's bust out a hand real quick. Why not? Yes, I'm aware that this is not the best hand. Again, we're just busting it out, just so that we can, like, talk about it, right? So, you've got your hand. This guy's got monster fingers for some reason. Right? We've got our hand. And what you might notice is that a ton of times when you have shadow falling, a lot of people will go like this, and they'll go boom, 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 and they'll mark this as the shadow, right? They'll just go like, yep, that makes sense. This is fine. Here's our shadow, you know. And that's all hunky dory. But what we're actually doing when we stop and observe what's happening in specific lighting scenarios, Twitch is somehow allowed on my work Wi-Fi. Also, hi, how's it going, Femdem? So what we're actually doing is we're not looking at this shadow with skin specifically, right? With skin specifically, we've got a lot of things that happen where there's this thing called the Terminator. I know, funny name. So this is called the Terminator. This is where shadow ends abruptly, right? That is the darkest dark of our shadow. And then we have an umbra, which is where shadow slowly starts to kind of fade away. And then it'll follow in suit. And then we usually experience something called bounce light, right? Whereas we have our light source, right? Coming down. We experience this light actually bouncing off of the ground back onto here, right? So it'll develop this kind of like highlight right here. But what also happens, especially with skin, you'll notice that there's actually a saturation effect happening. There's a line that exists within the shadows that happens where if you're doing skin per se, right? So let's do... Ooh, not that. Let's do... Let's make this a flesh orb, because why not, right? So you might instinctually think, okay, just, you know, add darker, right? And that might work, you know. And then we've got our Terminator. And that might work. That might be fine for you. Fine and well, whatever. And then, you know, we've got our bounced light. But what happens is that there's usually a hypersaturation point in your shadow line where the light hits. You'll get a more saturated version of your color. And where the shadow hits, you'll get a lighter kind of blue effect going on. It almost creates this chromatic aberration effect, right? And then from that point on, your shadow continues. Right? Where the shadow hits, there's a Sonic OC waiting. Yeah. And so your shadows will look more believable when you're actually hitting them with this kind of line, with this aberration that happens. And I want you to, I actually want you to stop and look at your hand where the shadow hits, where there's the light and it starts to change to shadow. You'll notice your brain will tell you there's two colors, right? Your skin tone and then the shadow skin tone. what I want you to do is actually look really closely, because what you'll see is 3 separate bands. You'll see your actual light skin tone, the dark shadow of your skin tone, and then right in the middle, there's usually a darker line. If you actually look closely, there's this darker line that happens. And so when you're doing shading and you're trying to do, you know, just like a real quick, like, okay, I'm just gonna do that. And that feels wrong, or it feels weird in a case, right? It's usually because shadow doesn't actually work that way. Shadows fall. Shadows will eventually taper off and bounce, and especially in skin tones, they'll have this saturation point that highlights in lighter lights. Subscribe to it. Thank you for the sub. So it's important to note that, right? And it's wild when you first look at it, you know? It's wild when you first start to notice that your skin tone has these 3 different bands depending on where the sunlight is actually hitting, right? And there's all sorts of lighting scenarios. There's subsurface scattering will happen too, and that's where you've got light coming in from behind your ear, and that'll like have more of a red. But when you're working with shadow, that's why they tell you never work in like black and white, right? Like never just make pure black shadows and just be like, boom, we're done, right? And this all goes into observing, into actually seeing the world how it is, right? Seeing the real way that stuff appears, you know? And slowing down and telling our brains, hey, brain, I'm gonna need you to chill for just a hot second, okay? We're doing something. What you were doing was cool and all. I'm gonna let you finish. But Eyes had the biggest hit of the year. And I'm not saying that working in iconography is wrong, right? Because right here, our little brain, that's an icon. And we all recognize it as a brain. At least I hope we do. You know. Let's just... You know, we all recognize it like as a brain. That's fine and well, and it makes sense. And so icons are good in some cases, right? It's for shortening things and just making it make sense. So we're good. We're Gucci. You can do icons. They're fine. It doesn't hurt to do them. But we want to start observing the world how we see it. Mine is way smoother than that. This has to do a lot, too, with not only shape and form, and stopping working with iconography and symbols, but also light. The way that we observe the world, right? The way that we see things is through light. That's how our eyes physically work. We see any of the details that light bounces off of. We see any of the details that the light bounces off of and goes into our eye, right? That gives us our information of the world. So learning how to do shading is everything. You can create as much as you want with line art, and you can give the illusion of depth or form or shape, but it's shadow that makes everything come together. It's shadow that gives things depth and feel. Light is the most important thing to keep in mind. And so you always want to be thinking about where is your light source, right? For example, we might have the sun is a common light source, and it might be coming down and bouncing. And you want to think how the light is going to reflect off of a surface into your eye. Because something that has a lot more bite, right? Something that has more ridges and texture and things that it might get caught on might catch light in weird spots, right? Like let's say, for example, we have our box, right? That our brain is trying to pack things into. Right? So we've got boop, we've got our tape, right? And so when the light's coming down and it's trying to hit, it might get stuck on a ridge like this, right? It might lighten up this ridge entirely and then bounce into our eyes. It might get caught on random spots that are dented in, right? And catch on that ridge before it bounces back into our eye. It might get caught on a surface or a bubble in the tape, perhaps. So as you're doing detailing, don't think specifically what lines need to go where and what, like, everything that, like, oh, is there like a line that goes here with this, and then oh, I'd like add the, you know, don't think about it that way. Instead, think, what would the light catch on? What would the light hit first before it bounces into your eye? Before you see things? What parts of the light wouldn't you see? Right? So in this bubble, we would have light going through, but on this edge of the tape, we might not get as much light, right? We're not going to get any of that. We're not going to get light right here either, because it's not really bouncing off that. It's got its ridge. It's going to hit past this first and skip over it and then bounce. That's where your shadow is going to come from, is anywhere that it's blocking the light, right? The light where it is right there isn't going to hit any of this, right? So we're not really going to see that as a lighter tone. The truth be told, we will have light hit that, but it's only after it bounces off of a surface, right? And then comes back. This is what is known as reflected lighting or ambient lighting. This will start to give it the actual shade of things that are around it. So let's say, for example, we have like a blue sidewalk. I know, wild. The light is going to come in the color that it wants to come in, which is usually pure white, because it's, you know, it's just light. And then it's going to bounce and take on the effect of that surface that it hits off of. Because when the light is reflecting and we're seeing the blue, must be the damn libs with their blue textured sidewalks, right? What it's going to do then is we're going to see it shift. It's going to catch all of the light here that makes it look blue and reflect that wavelength that we normally would see onto the surface, which is then going to reflect from that surface into our eyes. So lighting scenarios will change according to how your light is, right? Colors will shift. Anonymous gifter gifting tier 1 sub. Thank you for the tier 1 sub. So, your surface, right, will bounce off of, or your light, sorry, will bounce off of a surface, change its color, bounce off of another surface, and change its color back to you. Basically, light is going to scatter and bounce around as much as it can until it hits your eye, right? This is where something like the GTX ray tracing comes into play, right? Is what it's doing is it's calculating, and we're going to get a little bit into computers here, right? So GTX's ray tracing, what it does is it's not throwing out a million beams here to figure it out, right? That takes a lot of processing power. What it's doing instead is it's calculating it from the viewer's point, from the camera point. So it's calculating how many bounces it needs to do to get from the light source to your eyes from the eye, right? From the camera. You can kind of think about, you know, lighting in that way too when you're drawing. So we have, boom, that's where it's going to kind of start to get weaker. And each time it bounces, it gets stronger, or it gets weaker and weaker. So light will be the strongest from here as it travels. It's going to bounce off of this, and it's going to lose some of its power. And then it's going to bounce off of here. It's going to lose even more of its power, which means we're going to get darker and darker colors. But we're also going to get less and less detail, right? Because as things are bouncing, it might hit, you know, like a scratch or something in here, and then it's going to bounce away from us, and then it's going to take a while to, you know, bounce here and bounce here until it eventually reaches back to us, right? And this looks crazy. This looks insane, because it is. There's a whole science surrounding how we actually see, right? And that's what you're doing as an artist, is you're looking at how you actually see stuff. This isn't something you need to think about constantly, but if you understand light and shadow, if you understand how things actually work around you, right? Because without our rods or cones, we wouldn't see anything. We wouldn't be able to differentiate much of anything, really. We need all of those to bounce into our eye so that we see, you know, what kind of contrast or anything like that is around us. And that's where your detail is going to come from. That's where you get these principles of a hard edge, a soft edge, and eventually a lost edge, right? Is we have contrast, right? We have the light, where a hard edge will happen when you have an extreme contrast. For example, in this box, right, we've got light right here and no light right here, right? This right here, this edge is where the most contrast exists. That is a hard edge. That is where light happens and shadow happens. That is where, you know, light happens and light doesn't. This creates a hard edge, and this will affect things like sharp turns, right? You also get, let's shrink this down a bit. You also get something called a soft edge. So let's say we have our box, and suddenly we've got more surfaces to it, right? So our light source is still coming from here. And when it bounces off here, it's going to go into our eyes. And it might catch a little bit of this, but it's starting to get away from the light source. So it might get some of this and you know, like, have a harder time bouncing to our eyes. And then right here, again, it won't have as much. So what happens where there's not this absolute level of contrast is that you get your light coming in really light, and then it slowly starts to fade off. And this creates a turn, right? And then it eventually goes away entirely. So we'll do... And then it eventually goes away, right? And what we're creating is the illusion of a curve, right? We're creating this illusion with polygons, with surfaces, where everything is going back into our eye. However, we're not getting one sharp contrast. We're getting a fade, a gradient. That's a soft edge. That means that there's still a bit of contrast, but it kind of blurs. It doesn't necessarily go all in, you know, one quick, you know, sharp bit, but it definitely has some change. Now, in scenarios where there is extreme light and extreme dark, what we experience is something called a lost edge. And these will rarely happen in more than just, or, you know, it happens in art a lot, in photography a lot, because people will set up those kind of scenarios. But unless you have a lot of extreme light, you're not really going to see it pop up. But nonetheless, our lost edge is when, for example, we have a complex shape, such as an ear, right? And then we've got the little Y that happens, and we've got like our little thingy, and our lobe, and all that sort of stuff, right? Now, a lost edge might happen if there is extreme... Gifted a tier 1 sub. Thank you for the gift sub. You might get this extreme kind of scenario going on, right? Where we would normally see all the stuff that happens here, right? This guy's got a big honking ear. We normally see all the stuff that happens here. But in the case where there is a lot of light and a lot of shadow, what might happen is you'll get your shadows, but then slowly all of this will get lost into the background noise, right? You won't actually see the ear. You'll know it's there, but you won't actually see it, right? Actually, let's do that in the shadow color instead. Right. So you'll get your shadows, and there might be some light that's happening like right here, but then it slowly starts to turn and fade. And so that's where you know a situation is happening, where you know a curve or anything like that is happening. But a lot of times, all of the shadow shapes start to blend in with one another, right? We're getting our lost edge. Oop, let's do it like this, right? We're getting our lost edge is no longer... We're no longer thinking about planes and shapes like that when we're thinking in lost edges. A lot of times with painting, you'll think in shadow shapes instead, right? So what we're looking at now is this as a whole, right? That's our new shape, because that's the only way that we can define it, is our contrast. Is our contrast between either the background and the other surfaces, or, you know, the contrast between certain features. So when you're drawing, you need to take into account light the most, right? There's an artist named James Gurney, and that's Gurney. They are phenomenal with this. Make sure you go check them out. They'll absolutely explain everything under the sun about light and shadow shapes and all that sort of thing. But this goes back into not using symbols and iconography. We're observing what is actually happening, the actual shape of something, right? The way that light is curving and bending and coming back into our eyes. The way that the world truly is. And that's a hard thing to do, because that's not how we think by default. We think in boxes. And that can be hard to undo. We like boxes. They're neat. It's how our brains get information very quickly. Thousands and thousands of years of evolution have taught us to pick stuff apart and find patterns, right? We are great at patterns. We love patterns. It's what kept us alive, you know? It's how we knew this berry was dangerous, but this berry was safe, right? Very subtle differences in nature. And when we look at these and when we observe these and we piece it together, bitches love patterns. It's true, they do. We love patterns. We love them. We love them. We are able to put patterns in anything, even when it doesn't have a pattern. Have you ever looked at your ceiling and thought, you know, wow, that looks like a face? That's our brain. That's our evolutionary hardwire telling us that we need to put together some sort of pattern, that we need to recognize that. It's how we stay alive. So it's really, really hard to untrain. So don't get frustrated with yourself, right? Don't get mad if you're having a hard time moving away from boxes and moving into shadow shapes, right? It is okay to take time and be bad, and you need to allow yourself to be bad, right? You need to allow yourself to fail, because this isn't like, this seems complex, right? This seems like a lot. It seems really heavy, because it is. What you're not seeing when you see people draw is years of learning this stuff, right? You're seeing the end result where they put it all together. And the hat man, you owe him money. So that's a little bit of our chalk talk. If anybody has any questions, hit me with them. We're not going to get too deep and make like too long of a stream today. But I did want to explain a few things. And I'm going to be doing more of these chalk talks soon, right? We're going to go into a couple different art subjects and you know, put together things like this. There are tons of artists that exist on the internet that you can check out and observe, and you know, they'll go into it way more in depth than I ever could. Stan Prokopenko. I don't know if you've seen them, but they do a really good job of this stuff too. And the next designs. All three of these artists. Can you show the box example again? I understand the light reflecting, but how would the shadow diffuse on the ground? Okay, yeah, I can do that. So, we have our light source, right? We have our light source. And let's do our box in perspective, right? And so our light source is going to come down this way, right? This surface is going to hit light the most. But the sun, the main light source that we're seeing, isn't going to be throwing out just one line, just one light. It's going to be throwing light everywhere, right? And eventually it's going to hit off something like, I don't know, a rock or a tree or something like that. Other parts of the ground where it has a surface that it might bounce back. So the sun might throw it back here, and then it'll bounce back onto our surface. This happens all the time, right? This happens constantly. There are millions and millions and millions of particles of light being thrown out and bounced off of surfaces. This is bounce lighting or reflected lighting. You know, it might hit off the rock and hit onto here too. The sun is not our only light source, right? Because the sun is also throwing light off of here. It's also going straight up and into the sky, right? The sky creates a secondary lighting. This is called ambient lighting, right? Is that we have this entire sheet that is bouncing back all of our light rays, right? And it's going to shift it blue, because that's just how the sky is, and we can go into the science of that. But we're getting bounce light. And remember, every time that light bounces, and gets closer to our eye, every time it bounces, it loses power, right? It starts off really strong, right? Full bolt, and then as it goes, you're going to lose power until eventually it's almost nothing. And that's called ambient occlusion. That's a thing that happens in mostly video game settings, but it happens in real life. So it's going to keep losing power every time it bounces. Remember, it's bouncing from this light source into the sky and then bouncing back down to here, right? So we will get light. We won't get absolute shadow, right? From our box, right? We've got our light source going like this. It's going to cast a shadow right here. But then it's also going to bounce down here and light this up a bit. So what we're getting with our shadow is not pure black. We're instead getting the color of the sky, right? And then it's also going to bounce from here off of this surface onto the back surface, right? Light is going to scatter and bounce, and it's going to carry with it that color. So shadows are never going to be pure pitch black, right? Shadows are always going to take on the aspect of the surfaces around it. So when you create it in real space, or you want to create the illusion of it in real space, your shadows will end up a little bit more blue shifted during the day if you're in a very bright, sunny scenario, right? Or maybe even orange shifted if you're later in the day. Purple, green, whatever. As long as the lighting and the surface makes sense, it will change color accordingly. So when we're doing this, you'll notice we're not doing our pitch black right here, right? Because we could do that. We could absolutely do that. But then it just doesn't feel right, right? So what we can do is we can add a smidge of blue to that. We can go like this. And this is what creates something called a rich black. This is something that reads more naturally to our eyes. is because it'll never do pitch black. Pitch black doesn't really exist in reality, right? It can in certain scenarios, but it usually doesn't. And remember, we're also going to have our Terminator, our Umbra, right? So this is where ambient occlusion comes into play. There are points eventually where light gets so bounced, right? Because we think about it, we got to bounce it like off the ground, onto here, down to here, up to here, and eventually it'll keep bouncing its way, you know, trying to go boop, 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 to get into these little crevices where there might catch light, that it loses so much power that it almost looks like it's pure black. It just cannot light that thing, right? That's what ambient occlusion is. That's your darkest dark shadows, is it's occluding, or not including, ambient light, right? Our ambient light doesn't have enough power to get into this small crevice, so it's going to create this darker shadow. That's something that's hard to accomplish if you just do pure black, right? Is there's nowhere darker to go. So, look at your shadows and observe, and try to match what color they actually look like in reality. Because they're oftentimes not just pure black, right? You'll look at them and go, okay, there's an even darker color that exists. When we were talking about our thumb, our skin, right? You'll observe there's not just the two shades. There's entire bands that exist because of the light, right? And this sounds overwhelming. This sounds confusing. It'll take a while to internalize. And we'll do more advanced lessons on it. Like I said, check out James Gurney, Stan Prokopenko, Synex Designs. Check them out, because they'll explain this a little bit better and a little bit less rushed. But the main takeaway from this is that art is not simple. It's a very complex beast. And if you're starting and you're new and you think, gosh, I'm having trouble, this is super easy. It's not. We've been studying this for like 5 years now. I've done almost 12 hours a day for the first couple years to try to learn and cram as much of this subject into my little brain as I could, right? Which allows me to skip steps, right? It allows me to not show my work. It's like knowing 2 + 2 = 4. I don't need to do a bunch of complex stuff to show why 2 + 2 = 4. I don't need to set down, 2 circles plus 2 circles and then mush them together to tell you that. And so that's what we're doing, is we're skipping that phase. We're skipping that part that we used to do when we were little and when we were first learning this stuff. We're skipping that in doing these kinds of designs and in going, yes, this is going to have the most light. This is going to have some light. This is going to have no light, right? Is that I'm thinking about all of this without showing my work. Anyway, I think that'll do us for today. Did anybody have any other questions, or did I make anything unclear? Hopefully I haven't confused anybody. Yeah, of course. Well, everybody, that'll do me for today. Sorry that it was a weird little Chalk Talk stream. We've almost gone for about an hour, so, not terrible. But hopefully next time Mint and B will be joining us. I will see you guys next time. Thanks for stopping by. Bye-bye.